Before we begin, I want you to think about the last time you were in a room full of people and still felt completely alone. Maybe it was a party, maybe a family dinner, maybe a work meeting where everyone was talking and laughing, and you were right there in the middle of it, nodding along, and yet something in you was miles away. That feeling, quiet, a little embarrassing, impossible to explain, is exactly what tonight is about. Here's the thing that stopped researchers cold when they first looked closely at loneliness. The people most devastated by it were not the ones living alone. They were not recluses or hermits. They were people surrounded by others, people with full lives on paper. And that discovery, that loneliness, has almost nothing to do with how many people are around you, turned out to be just the first of many things the science of loneliness would upend. Because here is what decades of research have quietly confirmed. Loneliness is not a feeling. Not in the way we usually mean that word. It is a biological state, ancient, urgent, and physically measurable, with consequences for your heart, your immune system, the way your genes behave, and yes, the way you sleep tonight. Take a slow breath. Let your body settle wherever it is. We're going to move through this gently. The way you might walk through something you've been meaning to look at for a long time, but kept walking past. There is nothing to rush. There is only this. For most of human history, loneliness was treated as a circumstance. You were lonely because you were alone. Fix the aloneness. Fix the loneliness. Simple. Then the research came in, and it was not simple at all. The work that changed everything came from a social neuroscientist named John Cacioppo. For nearly 3 decades at the University of Chicago, Cacioppo studied what loneliness actually is. Not philosophically, not poetically, but at the level of biology. And the central finding of his life's work was this: loneliness is not about the number of people around you. It is about the gap between the social connection you have and the social connection you need. He called it perceived social isolation. The word perceived carries enormous weight there. You are not lonely because you are objectively alone. You are lonely because you experience yourself as disconnected, unseen, unmoved by, lacking bonds that feel real and mutual. That experience lives not in the world around you, but in the interpretive layer between that world and your own sense of belonging. This is why 2 people can sit at the same dinner table, in the same house, with the same number of people around them, and one feels warmly held while the other feels invisible. The external circumstances are identical. The nervous system's reading of those circumstances is worlds apart. Researchers separate several states that often get tangled together. Solitude is voluntary aloneness, something many people actively seek and find deeply nourishing. Objective social isolation is a measurable reduction in social contact. And loneliness is something that can exist without either of those, and often does. You can be alone without being lonely. You can be chronically lonely without ever being alone. There is also the distinction between situational loneliness, the kind that rises from a specific change, a move, a loss, a new city, and chronic loneliness, the kind that has settled in over months or years and begun to color the entire texture of daily life. Situational loneliness tends to resolve as circumstances shift. Chronic loneliness does something different entirely. It begins to reshape the brain. And, as the research now shows with quiet precision, it begins to reshape the body too. That is where the science becomes something you can no longer look away from. Here is something that might actually comfort you, strange as that sounds. Loneliness exists because you were built for connection. And that distinction between a flaw and a feature matters enormously for how we understand it. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived in small, cooperative groups. They hunted together, raised children together, shared warmth, and food and protection. A human separated from the group was in mortal danger. Real, immediate, life-ending danger. Predators were real. Cold was real. Starvation alone was real. Without the group, the odds of surviving collapsed. And so over deep evolutionary time, the brain developed a mechanism to warn against this danger. Cacioppo described it precisely. Loneliness is to the social body what hunger is to the physical body. Hunger doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It means your body needs fuel, and it is signaling that need with urgency. Loneliness doesn't mean something is wrong with you either. It means your social self needs nourishment, and it is signaling that need the only way it knows how, by making you feel it. This framing helps explain something that often bewilders people: why loneliness feels physical, why it registers in the chest, the stomach, the throat, why it keeps you awake, why it makes the world feel slightly sharper, slightly more watchful, slightly less safe. In 2003, neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA ran a study that made the mechanism visible for the first time. Participants were placed in an fMRI scanner and asked to play a simple virtual ball tossing game called Cyberball with what they believed were two other human players. At some point, the other players stopped throwing the ball to the participant, a small computer-generated social exclusion, low stakes by any measure. The brain scans told a different story. The regions that activated during social exclusion were the same regions that activate during physical pain, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, both central to the subjective experience of pain, the unpleasantness of it. Being left out of a trivial ball game by people the participant didn't even know lit up the same neural alarm as physical injury. The brain, it seems, does not clearly distinguish between a broken bone and a broken bond. Both register as threats. Both demand a response. And once you understand that, you understand why you cannot simply think your way out of loneliness, the way you might talk yourself out of an unfounded worry. The alarm is not coming from the reasoning brain. It is coming from something far older, far more urgent, far deeper than thought. This is the section where the science stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal. Because the research on what chronic loneliness does to the physical body is, by now, detailed enough to be humbling, and serious enough to have reframed how public health researchers think about the whole problem. The first body of evidence came from molecular biologist Steve Cole at UCLA, working alongside Cacioppo. Using a technique called transcriptomy analysis, they examined gene expression in immune cells of chronically lonely individuals. What they found was striking. Loneliness was associated with increased expression of genes involved in inflammation. The same low-grade, persistent inflammatory state linked to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cognitive decline, and decreased expression of genes involved in fighting viral infections. Consider what that means. The body of a chronically lonely person is, at the cellular level, simultaneously more inflamed and less equipped to fight off illness. The mechanism, as far as researchers can tell, runs through the stress response system, a topic we'll come back to, and through the way perceived threat alters the behavior of immune cells over time. Then came the landmark work on mortality. In 2010, Julianne Holt-Lundstad at Brigham Young University published a meta-analysis in PLOS Medicine, drawing on 148 studies and over 308,000 participants. The conclusion: poor social connection was associated with a roughly 50% increased likelihood of early death, comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. The findings stunned the public health community. Her follow-up research in 2015 extended and refined those findings across 70 additional studies. And a separate meta-analysis published in Heart Journal in 2016 by Valtorta and colleagues found that social isolation and loneliness were specifically linked to around a 29% increased risk of coronary heart disease and a 32% increased risk of stroke. The comparison to smoking, which had once seemed hyperbolic when Holt-Lundstad first proposed it, began to look, if anything, modest. The stress hormone cortisol is at the center of this story. When the brain perceives a social threat, which, as we've seen, it registers much like a physical one, it activates the body's stress response, triggering a sustained release of cortisol. In the short term, this is adaptive, but in chronically lonely individuals, studies have found persistently elevated cortisol levels, meaning the alarm system is not switching off. Around the clock, the body is braced, and the consequences of that sustained bracing include suppressed immune function, disrupted digestion, accelerated cellular aging, and, here is where sleep enters the picture, a profound disruption of rest. The cardiovascular system is caught in this too. Lonely individuals show higher resting blood pressure, lower heart rate variability, a measure of the nervous system's resilience and flexibility, and accelerated arterial stiffening over time. These associations hold even after controlling for diet, exercise, and smoking. None of this is meant to frighten you. It is meant to do what good science has always done at its best. Take seriously something people have felt in their bodies for centuries, but that the culture has often dismissed as weakness, as self-pity, as something to push through. Loneliness is not a mood. It is a biological state with measurable consequences, and one that, as of very recently, has become a global emergency. Here is where the science offers its most quietly devastating finding, and its most important one for understanding why chronic loneliness is so hard to escape. Cacioppo and his team developed what became one of the most influential frameworks for understanding the long arc of loneliness, what he called the hypervigilance model. When an organism is chronically exposed to social threat, it makes evolutionary sense to become more alert to danger, to assume threat rather than safety when the evidence is unclear, to read ambiguous social signals as hostile. On the ancestral savanna, this probably kept isolated individuals alive. A lone human who assumed the worst was more likely to survive the night. But in the modern social world, this same recalibration becomes profoundly counterproductive. A chronically lonely brain begins to interpret ambiguous social situations as threatening. A brief text response reads as distance. A neutral expression feels like disapproval. A pause in conversation registers as discomfort or rejection. These are not conscious interpretations. They are the automatic output of a brain that has been, quite literally, rewired by sustained perceived threat. Neuroimaging studies have confirmed this pattern. Chronically lonely individuals show heightened amygdala activation, faster, stronger responses to social rejection cues. And at the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning and emotional regulation, shows a reduced ability to bring that amygdala response back down. The alarm goes up fast, and it stays up. And then comes the twist that makes chronic loneliness one of the cruelest feedback loops in human psychology. The very brain state that loneliness creates. Hypervigilant, threat-attuned, prone to reading neutral interactions as rejection, makes it harder to form the connections that would resolve it. Someone in this state may seem guarded to others. They may pull back from relationships before those relationships have a chance to deepen. They may misread warmth as pity, or kindness as a precursor to disappointment. The loneliness creates the conditions that perpetuate it. This is not a personal failing. It is a neurological one. The output of an ancient system doing exactly what it was designed to do, in a world it was never built for. And understanding it is not just academically useful. It is the difference between approaching a lonely person, or a lonely version of yourself, with blame, and approaching them with something closer to accurate understanding. Based on what we know about neuroplasticity, we can reasonably assume that this recalibration is not permanent. The brain changes with experience in both directions, toward threat and back toward safety. But that return journey takes time and gentleness, and in many cases, skilled support. Before the world changed in 2020, the warning signs were already quietly accumulating. In 2018, the United Kingdom appointed a Minister for Loneliness, a formal cabinet-level position whose existence was an acknowledgement that something unprecedented had happened to the social fabric of modern life. A national survey had found that more than 9 million British adults reported often or always feeling lonely. Former U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy had, years before, described loneliness as having reached epidemic proportions in the United States, noting that it was among the most common conditions he encountered across his years of practice as a physician. In 2019, a major survey by the health insurer Cigna found that 61% of American adults reported feeling lonely. And here's the finding that upended the most comfortable narrative. Young adults, people in their 20s, reported higher rates of loneliness than older adults, including the elderly. The assumption that loneliness was primarily a problem of old age and physical isolation began to crumble. Then, in early 2020, the pandemic arrived, and it did not create the loneliness crisis. It held a magnifying glass over one that had been smoldering for decades. Billions of people experienced, in a matter of weeks, a sudden and near total contraction of their social worlds. Schools, offices, restaurants, gathering places of every kind went quiet. Physical contact with anyone outside the immediate household ceased for many people, for days, then weeks, then months. Those living alone, a growing and significant segment of the population in nearly every industrialized country, were suddenly without any in-person human contact at all. The research documented the effects with grim consistency. Studies across multiple countries found sharp increases in reported loneliness. Some estimates suggested rates had roughly doubled in the early months of the pandemic. And crucially, the increases were sharpest among those already most vulnerable. Young adults who had lost the social infrastructure of education, people living alone, those who had lost employment, and the elderly isolated in care facilities. By 2023, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued a formal advisory on the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, the kind of document usually reserved for crises like opioid addiction or obesity. It concluded that the United States, along with much of the rest of the developed world, faced a loneliness crisis with serious, measurable consequences for individual and population health. It called for a renewed national commitment to social infrastructure, the physical spaces, civic institutions, and cultural norms that once supported incidental human connection. The pandemic accelerated a crisis that structural modernity had been building for generations. The dissolution of third places, the digitization of work and leisure, the design of cities and suburbs that remove the conditions for the kind of low-key, accidental human proximity that used to simply be part of daily life. We built a world optimized for individual efficiency. We did not notice until too late what we had quietly dismantled. Here's where tonight's subject and tonight's setting become one. The connection between loneliness and disrupted sleep has been documented across dozens of studies, but it was Cacioppo's team that gave it a mechanistic explanation, one that, once you hear it, is almost impossible to forget. In research at the University of Chicago, they found that lonelier individuals consistently reported worse sleep, more difficulty falling asleep, more frequent awakenings, less sense of restoration in the morning. These findings held even after controlling for depression, anxiety, and physical health. Loneliness was an independent predictor of disrupted sleep. They went further. Using wrist actigraphy, a method of objectively tracking sleep across multiple nights, the researchers found that lonelier individuals were experiencing micro-awakenings throughout the night. Brief, often unconscious, arousals. The kind where you don't remember waking, but your body surfaced briefly into alertness, briefly scanned, and then descended again. The proposed explanation draws directly on the hypervigilance model. A brain recalibrated by chronic social threat does not fully stand down at night. The lonely brain, anticipating danger, biased toward threat, enters sleep in a lighter, more fragile state. This, researchers suggest, may be an ancient adaptation. A lone human, sleeping at the edge of the group, needed to wake quickly if something approached in the dark. What that means in the modern world is that chronic loneliness may be literally restructuring the architecture of sleep, shifting time away from deep, slow-wave sleep, the most physically restorative stage, and from REM sleep, the stage most important for emotional processing and memory consolidation. Less deep sleep means more cortisol, more inflammation, more impaired emotional regulation the next day, which makes warmth and social ease harder, which deepens the loneliness, which further fragments the sleep. And then, in 2018, E.T. Ben Simon and Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley's Center for Human Sleep Science published findings in Nature Communications that closed the loop in a direction no one had quite expected. They found that sleep-deprived participants kept other people further away, physically, measurably further, than when they were well rested. They felt lonelier and were less interested in social contact. The brain's social engagement networks were quieter. The threat detection systems were louder. But the finding that stopped researchers was this: when well-rested observers watched videos of sleep-deprived participants for as little as 60 seconds, those observers also began to report feeling lonelier. Sleep deprivation was not merely antisocial. It was, in Walker's words, socially contagious. The loneliness spread, person to person, in under a minute. Think about that for a moment. You can transmit loneliness to someone simply by being in the same room, sleep deprived, and you can receive it from them without knowing why and carry it home. This is the loop. Loneliness breaks sleep. Broken sleep deepens loneliness. Deepened loneliness breaks the sleep of people nearby. And so the condition propagates, quietly, invisibly, through the fabric of daily life. If loneliness is a signal of perceived disconnection, you would expect that the explosion of digital communication, the ability to reach virtually anyone at any time, would have resolved it. Many researchers, technologists, and cultural commentators made exactly that assumption. The data did not cooperate. The same decades that witnessed the most extraordinary expansion of digital communication tools also witnessed some of the steepest rises in reported loneliness, particularly among young people. The most digitally connected societies on Earth consistently rank among the loneliest. This correlation alone does not prove causation, and researchers are careful to note that. The relationship between technology and loneliness is genuinely complex and depends heavily on how technology is used. What research does suggest is that qualitative differences between digital and in-person interaction matter to the nervous system in ways that are difficult to replicate. In-person contact involves the full range of human communication: eye contact, touch, the subtle physiological synchrony that emerges between two bodies in shared space, the way breathing and heart rates can gradually align without either person noticing. Many of these elements are absent from digital interaction, or present only in attenuated form. In 2019, Amy, Orban, and Andrew Przybylski published an analysis of large-scale data from British adolescents and found that the association between social media use and well-being was real, but modest in size. Crucially, the direction of the relationship depended on how social media was used. Heavy passive use, scrolling, comparing, observing, was associated with worse outcomes. Active communicative use, messaging specific people, sharing personal content, showed a much weaker or negligible association. There is also the matter of parasocial connection, the sense of relationship that forms with content creators, podcasters, streamers, public figures you have never met and will never meet. These one-sided relationships can provide genuine short-term comfort. There is warmth in a familiar voice. There is something in being with someone's thoughts, even at a remove. But they do not meet the underlying need, because they do not involve genuine mutual recognition. The creator does not know you exist, and the part of you that most needs to be known remains below the surface, quietly unmet. This is not a condemnation of digital life. The research also finds that for people whose identities, circumstances, or locations make in-person community difficult to access, LGBTQ+ youth in unsupportive environments, people with chronic illness, those whose neurodivergence makes certain kinds of in-person interaction genuinely painful, online communities can provide something more than a substitute. They can provide the only form of genuine mutual belonging available. For those people, the question of whether digital connection is real enough misses the point entirely. The science asks something simpler. Are you using connection to actually connect? Or to feel, for a few minutes at a time, like you might be? Most people picture loneliness as something visually legible. An elderly person eating dinner alone. Someone new to a city who doesn't know anyone. These images are real, but they capture only the most visible edge of something far wider. There is what philosophers have called existential loneliness. The recognition that however loved you are, however rich your social world, there is an irreducible core of consciousness that no other person can fully enter. You are, at some level, alone in your experience of being alive. Thinkers from Kierkegaard to the contemporary psychotherapist Irvin Yalom have written about this not as pathology, but as one of the fundamental givens of human existence. Something mature psychological health involves learning to sit with rather than flee from. There is the loneliness of misattunement, of being in close relationships with people who love a version of you that doesn't quite match who you actually are, who respond to the person they expect rather than the one standing in front of them. This form of loneliness is particularly hard to name because from the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, you're translating yourself constantly into a language that others can receive rather than simply speaking in your own. There is the loneliness of grief, not just the loss of a person, but the loss of the world that person made possible. The specific, unrepeatable quality of a bond that only two people shared. And then there is perhaps the most culturally underacknowledged form, the loneliness of people who appear, by every visible measure, to be doing well, who have busy social lives, full calendars, many acquaintances, and who lie awake at night feeling, in some quiet and bewildering way, unseen. Men, in particular, navigate a cultural context that has historically discouraged the expression of relational need. Research consistently finds that men report fewer close friendships and less frequent emotional disclosure to those friends than women do, even while reporting equivalent levels of loneliness. The need, it is equally present. The language and permission to express it is not. Across cultures, the experience of loneliness is filtered through different norms and carries different meanings. In some contexts, admitting loneliness carries significant stigma, a confession that one is somehow socially insufficient. And that stigma, we can infer, compounds the suffering. When you cannot name what you feel, or cannot tell anyone you feel it, the experience deepens quietly, without interference. This, perhaps, is why you are here tonight. Not because anything is wrong with you, but because something in you recognized the topic and leaned toward it. That is not pathology. That is honesty. Given everything we have walked through, the biology, the neural loops, the feedback cycles, the question of what actually helps with loneliness requires more care than a list of well-meaning suggestions. Researchers are increasingly clear on one crucial point. Simply increasing social contact is not reliably effective for people in states of chronic loneliness. Because, as we have seen, chronic loneliness changes the way the brain processes social information. You can put a lonely person in more social situations without touching the hypervigilance that makes those situations feel unrewarding or threatening. More contact, in itself, does not necessarily feel like connection. What has shown more durable effects are approaches that target the perceptual and cognitive dimensions of loneliness, specifically the automatic tendency to interpret ambiguous social signals as threatening. Cognitive behavioral approaches adapted for loneliness help people notice those automatic interpretations and test them against evidence. Not to force optimism, but to gently interrupt the threat-first assumption and ask, is there another way to read this? Mindfulness-based interventions have also shown meaningful results. Research published in 2019 and 2020 found that mindfulness training reduced loneliness in adults, and that the reduction was reflected in biological markers, including the inflammatory gene expression patterns that Steve Cole's work had identified. Changing how the mind relates to experience appears to change something in the body as well. Social prescribing, a model developed in the United Kingdom and now spreading internationally, takes a structural approach. Rather than treating loneliness solely as a psychological problem, it connects individuals with community activities, groups, and resources through a dedicated link worker who helps navigate options. Early research has shown meaningful reductions in loneliness, particularly when the activities are matched to the person's genuine interests, and when the social environment is welcoming rather than merely available. And then there is meaning. The dimension that Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, argued was the deepest protection against isolation. His logotherapy rested on the observation that people with a strong sense of meaning and purpose in their lives endure even profound suffering with remarkable resilience. Contemporary research has supported this intuition. People who feel that their lives have direction report lower loneliness even in objectively isolated circumstances. And meaning does not require other people directly. It can emerge from creative work, from contribution to something larger than oneself, from the contemplative relationship with nature, with art, with the life of the mind. Here is the final reveal that I want to leave you with, the one that reframes everything we have covered. The science of loneliness is not, ultimately, a science of what is missing. It is a science of how the body and brain respond to the deepest of human needs. And in that framing, chronic loneliness is not evidence that you have failed at connection. It is evidence that you are a social creature who has not yet found the conditions in which your nature can express itself fully. Alarm is not the problem. The alarm is telling you something true. The question is only whether you can begin, gently, to listen to it differently. So here we are, at the end of a long and quiet walk through one of the most human things there is. You have heard about the biology, the way chronic loneliness reshapes the body at the level of genes and hormones, of inflammatory markers and cardiovascular risk. You have heard about the brain, the hypervigilance loop, the threat sensitivity, the self-reinforcing cycle that makes the condition so difficult to simply decide your way out of. You have heard about the epidemic, the numbers, the public health advisories, the pandemic that accelerated what modernity had already been quietly building for decades. You have heard about sleep, about the micro-awakenings, the fragmented architecture of rest, the 60-second clip of a stranger that can leave you feeling inexplicably alone. And perhaps, somewhere in all of it, you recognize something, a texture of experience that suddenly had a name, or a mechanism, or a little more compassion attached to it. If you are someone who has felt lonely, recently, or for a long time, I want to be honest with you. The science does not promise a simple resolution, but it does say something clear and important. The feeling is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that you are human, built for something, signaling for something, still reaching toward it. There is research on something called physiological synchrony, the way two people's heart rates, breathing patterns, and neural rhythms can gradually align simply from sharing space in a calm and unhurried way. Not even necessarily talking, just being near one another. The nervous systems, it seems, have a way of finding each other, given the chance. There is something in that finding that speaks to why human beings have always gathered, not for any specific purpose, not always with anything particular, to say, but simply to be in proximity to one another, to feel, wordlessly and biologically, that they are not alone in whatever this is. Maybe something in that spirit applies even here. You chose to be here tonight. You reached towards something. A topic, a voice, a subject that felt worth sitting with for a while. And somewhere in that reaching, something is already happening that isn't quite as lonely as it might appear. If this felt like something worth returning to, I would love for you to stay. Subscribe if you'd like. Leave a thought in the comments. I genuinely read them. Share this with someone who might need it tonight. But mostly, rest well. Let the hypervigilance soften. Let the night be, for now, simply quiet. You are safe here. And in the morning, the world will still be there, full of its imperfect, complicated, irreplaceable opportunities to be known. Sleep gently.